I have two pictures in my mind. The first is on your, what's this called, weekly. The top half of it, it's only half, unfortunately. It's a picture of the resurrection. I think the whole thing was on the cover of last Sunday's bulletin. And you'll notice that what's happening here is that Jesus is pulling up Adam and Eve out of Hades. Now, what you don't see is that Jesus is kind of straddling the pit of Hades, and the doors of Hades are blasted off of their hinges, and the lock's flying one way and the hinges are flying another. Jesus' resurrection is about community. It's about bringing all those who went before him along with him. Now, the second picture I have in my head, any of you ever been to Notre Dame? There's a beautiful library there, and on the side of the library is a mosaic. It's about 10 stories tall. It's huge. And there is Jesus, the risen Christ, standing there, like this. Now, it's interesting that when they built the library, there's a reflecting pool in front of the library, which leads right to the end zone of the stadium. So this risen Christ is nicknamed Touchdown Jesus. Now, I point that out because if you look at most of Western art, it's a good example of it, but most of Western art, you only see Jesus coming out of the tomb carrying a white flag. It's all about Jesus and only Jesus. And that's the way most of what we picture in the Western church is about the resurrection. It's kind of a lone event that Jesus kind of wins, like this. In the Eastern church, it's totally different. He goes down with the people, and he pulls them up with him. He pulls them, as Stephen said in last Sunday's sermon, he pulls them into the future. Now, I raise this issue because I think we've missed something here of what it means to be a community. And we get a sense of this over the past 5 or 6 weeks. Several weeks ago, we heard a gospel reading from John where Mary brings a bottle of costly nard perfume and puts it on Jesus' feet and wipes them with his hair. One of the most intimate moments in John's gospel. And then later on, in the next chapter, Jesus is with his disciples at supper, and he washes their feet. Yet another intimate moment with the disciples. He goes to his crucifixion. In his crucifixion, he binds 2 people together, his mother and the beloved disciple. Mother, here's your son. Son, here's your mother. And he takes the beloved disciple, it says, takes Mary home to live with him. And then we had last Sunday's gospel, Mary and the beloved disciple and Peter run to the tomb. Peter looks in. The beloved disciple looks in and believes. We don't know what he believes, but that's what it says. And then they leave. But Mary hangs around in the garden, and while she's in the garden, she runs into the gardener, she thinks. Now, I'll never be able to listen to this story again without Stephen's take on it that since all his grave clothes were gone, he either went to the shed and found some gardener's clothing, or he was naked, one or the other. But anyhow, there's this intimate moment when Jesus says, Mary, and her eyes are opened and she recognizes him and she says, Rabboni. And he says, don't cling to me. Scripture doesn't tell us that she did cling to him, but he's got a foretaste of what may be coming because, as Stephen said last week, he senses that she wants him to go back to being Rabboni, the way things used to be. And Jesus' resurrection is always carrying us forward, not backwards, forward into God's future. So we have all these intimate things going on here. Why? Well, let's set a context for this. John is writing to a community of Jews who have come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And he writes his book to tell us, as the last verse in the gospel this morning says, to tell us that Jesus, that he's told all these stories. He said, there are lots of other stories I could tell you, but I'm telling you these stories so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, the problem is that when they decided to say they believed in this, they got thrown out of the synagogue, which meant they lost social status, they lost protection, they lost a whole level of family and social status. And what John is trying to do is he's trying to tell them, you are bound together in Jesus. All these intimate stories are about how Jesus is available to us. And so we hear this morning, always the first Sunday after Easter, yeah, it looks like Christmas out there, Easter, we hear the story of the so-called doubting Thomas. Now, I want to give Thomas his due. Everybody else got to see Jesus in his hands and his feet. That's all he wanted. And he kind of gets a bum rap for it as the years go on. He just wanted to see the same thing that they saw. If there was something wrong here, it's that he didn't believe his brothers, who he'd been hanging out with for a couple of years, that what they saw was true. But Jesus comes into their midst, and notice several things. He says, "Peace be with you," 3 times. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were Jesus, and I'd been working with these disciples for a couple years, and they all deserted me in my crucial hour, I'd be kind of ticked off. And what does he say? Where were you when I needed you most? No. You guys really blew it? No. Peace be with you. And I've got a job for you. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you hold on to them, they aren't. He's saying, I probably have every right in the world to stand here and really give it to you guys. That's not how I trained you, but it's what you did, and I'm not going to say a word about it. I'm going to wish you peace. I'm going to be not only the model of one who dies for you, but the model of one who lives for you, who forgives for you. And so he says to Thomas, "Thomas, put your hand here. See the nails. Touch my wounds." Here's yet another piece of intimacy that Jesus calls us, that John is pointing out to us, of how the community comes together. Comes together in forgiveness. It comes together in our wounds. Now, I'm willing to bet you that there's not one single person here that says, I don't have any wounds. We all have our wounds. They may be big, they may be small. The problem with wounds is that 3 things can happen to them. The first thing is you can deal with them and get on with your life. The second thing you can do with your wounds is say they don't exist And when you do that, what you really do is you pass them on to somebody else. If you look around our world, what we see most of all in the violence around us is people putting their wounds on somebody else. And the other thing we can do is we can hold them in. And I'll tell you, it's not a good idea to hold them in, because they fester and they really mess up your life. So what Jesus does here is gives us an example of what you do with your wounds. You let the world see them. You don't dwell on them. You don't complain about them. You don't say, oh, if you guys would have been better than this, I wouldn't have these wounds. He just lets them hang out. And he allows us to touch them, because that's how we find healing for ourselves. Being able to allow our wounds not to bleed on someone. It's the last thing we want to do. That's what's happening to us so much. But to allow our vulnerability. And it's our vulnerability that binds us together. It's that intimacy that we keep seeing all through the Gospel of John. Some of our folks went to hear Greg Boyle speak a couple weeks ago. For those who don't know about Greg Boyle, Father Greg Boyle, about 30 years ago, living in the barrio of Los Angeles, said, this gang stuff is just not acceptable. I've got to do something about it. And he went to work working with gangs. And his story is quite a story about what he came to learn about working with gangs. And one of the things he learned is you don't work with a gang, you work with individuals. You work from the edge. You don't get in the middle of it. And Father Boyle had with him, Amy told me about this. Amy, if I'm wrong, you tell me later, because I'm going to make it work. I'm going to try to. He had with him at this lecture some other people, some of the boys, and some social workers. And one of the social workers said, we've been working with gangs for a long time, and we social workers have kind of a checklist that we go down to see what we've done. This is the way we work with gangs. This is the way we work with kids. And she said, the one thing I never heard anytime I worked as a social worker is something I hear from Father Boyle. I just lost the word. Amy, what's the word? Tenderness. It's what we see in this gospel this morning. It's what we see all through the gospel. The way Jesus interacts with people is with tenderness. Father Boyle has written a couple books. One of them is Tattoos on the Heart, the Power of Boundless Compassion. I think tenderness is better than boundless compassion, but it means the same thing. It's what we're called to. There are fire and brimstone preachers out there that try to scare you into heaven. It doesn't work. Some people may be scared, but it really doesn't get you there. What gets us there is tenderness, boundless compassion. And we see that in Jesus all through his life and into his risen life. And he comes amongst us once again this day to say, touch my wounds. And he binds us into a new kind of community, a community of resurrection, a community whose basis is based in forgiveness, not in retribution. Oh, that we could learn a new kind of justice in our world. We live under justice of retribution when we should be living with the justice of reconciliation. There's some places in this world that are learning how to do this. Maybe we will too someday. But our job as Christians is not retribution, ever. It's always forgiveness. Forgive the sins of any If you hold on to them, it doesn't help the person that you're holding on to, and I'll tell you, it really doesn't help you either. Peace be with you, he said. Not, you guys blew it, but peace be with you. And he calls us into that union. The Father and I are one, and you and I are one. And each week he calls us to this table to share the bread, to break the bread, to remind us that we are one. Amen.